Hello, folks. It's Michael with the ccerp podcast, E for Ecology. Hope you're doing well, weathering this quarantine storm nonsense, getting outside. Hope you're getting out, get some sunshine, vitamin D, nature, fresh air. Um, Now, today, on the episode, we will be talking to Tim Seiter, a Ph.D. student in history. He's going to discuss with us some history of our area in South Texas, Native American history. Tim, could you say hi to folks and introduce yourself, please?
Sure. As Michael said, I'm a current PhD student at Southern Methodist University. I'm writing a dissertation on the Karankawa Indians who resided and still reside on the Texas Gulf Coast. I'm also working on an article that examines the daily life of presidial soldiers in the 18th century. Beyond my scholarly work, I'm into gardening, rock climbing, I play a lot of tennis, and recently I've been getting into automotive work. I actually just purchased a 2001 Grand Marquis last week, and I'm rebuilding that.
Wow, that's nice. How long have you been doing rock
Yeah.
climbing?
Oh, for maybe 5 or 6 years. Yeah, I started in Houston, and it's totally flat, so
Yeah.
rock climbing's an interesting sport to be getting into. But yeah, it's been fantastic. It's a lot of fun.
You do it outdoor, indoor, or what?
A bit of both. The best climbing, I guess, closest to us is around Austin. Um, there's a place called Reimers, which is fantastic for lead climbing. Do you climb yourself?
Oh, no. I like, I do natural fitness. When I climb, it's in trees. I
All right.
do climb trees.
you know,
I might want to do some rock
I
climbing
actually,
though. It's kind of like what I do. You know,
yeah,
outgrowing.
I actually find climbing trees is like harder on the hands than
Huh.
like some climbing. I mean, where I go, it's very polished. Like some people have climbed the route that the stone actually becomes polished,
Huh.
but
Yeah.
some trees are like they hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. The different bark, the oak and all that. Yeah. But cool. Um, did you do sports when you were younger? Like you done them your whole life?
Yeah, exactly. My family was pretty active, so it just worked out that way.
Cool. Does it come up with what you do? Or are you mostly doing research indoors, like at a desk, or you get out a lot? Do you research outside a lot, or what?
Yeah, that's a great question. In graduate school, typically it's a very like sedentary job. I'm sitting at my desk for most every day. But when I was an undergraduate, I got this thing called CERF, which the University of Houston offers, and they provided me funding. I actually got to go around the Gulf Coast and take pictures of where like the Karankawas and other native groups resided.
Hmm.
So I was able to actually like kayak to Matagorda Island, like spend a couple nights there, a night there, and take pictures of where they live and do all that type of stuff.
Nice.
But yeah, right now it's very very sedentary.
Mm-hmm. Are you gonna do something a little more active when you get out, or any idea yet, or just
I
kind of
mean
like
that's
find a job or what in the economy?
a Yeah, I like that question as well. I mean, it's an interesting one because right now universities are producing a lot of PhD students, and there's only so many tenured track professorship jobs. And as you know, my area of expertise is Native American studies, and for like the past century, non-Indians like myself have been teaching Native history. And I feel like Native peoples deserve to have, indigenous people telling their history. And so it's not a good idea for me to be looking for Native history jobs. And so I'm actually trying to rebrand myself to like a colonial historian.
Hmm.
But yeah, as far as job prospects, it's limited for most PhDs at the moment.
But on the other hand, we need more people talking about some Native American history, hearing more about it. Um,
Yeah, especially from like natives themselves,
yeah,
right? I mean, whenever do you grow up in Texas by chance?
yeah, mostly. Um,
Did you ever meet like anybody native or have anybody native teach you?
like Native American.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not that I recall.
Yeah, me neither. I mean, we learned about Texas history in junior high and all this other, history we learned about Texas, but it never seems to come from an indigenous person, right?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's one thing, like I've said in some other episodes, one thing I wish, one big want and wish in life that'll never happen would be to talk to some Native Americans who lived along the creek and knew the history of it for thousands of years to find out more about the area, the ecology, how things have changed, because with thousands of years of experience living here, they'd know the area more than anybody else. But
Yeah,
unfortunately, as you know, that's never going to happen. But if I could have, that's one thing I wish I could do to really learn the area. Talk to someone like that. A human being who's got traditions going back thousands of years in this area. That would be just beyond incredible.
it exactly, like, it would be an amazing conversation, and you put it so well, because these natives have lived in these places for thousands of years. Especially like with the Karankawas, we're able to know where they lived. We know that they lived along the Gulf Coast for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and the same people, the same culture persisting. But the fortunate thing for us is that a lot of folks consider these Indian groups to be totally extinct, and that's just not the case. We have the Karankawas, the Karankawa, who are coming back and making a resurgence. The Akokisa, who are based out of Louisiana right now, are also doing the same thing. So, people think these groups are extinct, but they're not. And you can contact Native peoples today if need be.
Cool. I just wonder how much, genetically they got that, but I wonder how much they remember about this area in particular,
Yeah, another good point, right? Because we have to take into consideration that the Native peoples that survive today have faced, genocide, the dislocation, and so they've been removed from this land that they live among, and so their experiences are different than their ancestors, or some at least.
Yeah. How'd you get interested in history?
Yeah, so around a decade ago, I withdrew from the University of Houston because I just had no idea what I wanted to study. And for the next 2 years, I ended up bumming around and hiking like 1,000 miles on the Appalachian.
I didn't do that. Yeah, I did like 2 years, dropped out for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, it was just a little bit too much to ask. I just had no idea what I wanted to do, and so I just ended up going on a few long distance hikes, like on the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail. And then after doing all that, I realized that college life wasn't so bad, and I re-enrolled, and I went to a community college called Alvin Community College, and it was fantastic. I had a professor named Andrew Joseph Pagoda, who was a history professor, and then from there, I just decided to pursue history, and now 8 years later, I'm in the Ph.D. program at SMU.
Cool. So you didn't really have the interest in it that you do now when you were young?
It was always a fun subject. It's one that I enjoyed the most, and at that age, I was more concerned with, reading fantasy books than, actually writing like historical records. Mm-hmm. What happened with you? You said you dropped out as well?
Yeah. So, but it was more, I think I must have been autistic spectrum or something when I was young growing up. It's a spectrum. It affects people differently. But, so I think I didn't really get working for a while, get the concept. And, like even when I went to college, I just went not because I thought it was a good idea or I had a plan. It's just, well, you just kind of do. And I just go along like whatever. And, I guess I'm good at math in high school, so I guess I'll study that in college. But
yeah,
it just, and then I did get a degree in that. But I went 2 years, kind of got burnt out, since I didn't really have much direction. There wasn't the push to keep going, and I just kind of did it for the grades and for the mental activity, not for anything having to do with life. I just didn't get that at the time. And so I dropped out, but then went back and finished, and still took a while to kind of figure the world out, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the way I did it. So you were probably more gathered and connected and goal-directed and all that than I was.
I like what you said about how, it kind of just felt like a logical next step. Like, we're just told we need to go to college. It doesn't matter, like, what you do. You just need to be there, right? And that's not always... do you think that's the wisest decision? Like, I don't particularly.
College is overrated. College is way overrated. Too many people go. People could do... and partly I think people go because high school, people don't learn as much in high school as they should. It's just a cultural, systemic thing. If some things were dialed in better, educational system was better, teachers in schools had more support and...
Yeah, exactly.
Like, had some better philosophy. It's not their fault. It's not like it's obvious. I sure the hell didn't know for a long time. Stuff I know now, I'd fight like hell and work hard to learn from other people and figure out. Not something I could have figured out on my own. That's why I was clueless for such a long time. I even remember now, I didn't know it then, but looking back, when I was in high school, I couldn't put the feeling into words, but I know now the way I'd put it is just I was kind of lost and clueless. But having learned more about thinking and education and reasoning and logic from some other people, things I've read, the world and being human and thinking makes more sense. Know how to do it better.
Yeah.
As Newton said, even though he discovered all he did, he still felt like a child on the beach discovering a new pebble because he knew that there was so much more in the universe to discover.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Not to compare myself to Newton in any way other than that. But, it's in the proper sense of the word, the phrase, the more you learn, the less you know, because there's so much more out there. You become less ignorant. I know when we're younger, we think we know it all. In some ways, a lot of us. But the more you dig into things, the more questions you have, the more you learn. There's more to learn. But
yeah, focusing on this native stuff and all the colonial Texas, the more research you do, the more you realize how much there is to learn, how many nuances there are. It's very interesting in that way.
Yeah. So your experience in being out of college is different. I think mine was kind of unique.
This is withdrawing from college, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. It for me, it really helped me understand. It gave me a direction, I suppose. I decided to come back and really put more thought and effort into academia and education, and it worked out for me. But I do wish when I was younger I experimented with other trades, like electrical work or even plumbing.
Mm-hmm. Cool. It's good to be well-rounded like that.
Yeah, I agree.
Have you read the book Range by David Epstein?
I haven't, no.
Well, you might enjoy that. Read it, listen on Audible. It's about how we should be more general in our thinking and learning and not get all carried away with specialization.
Mm.
Gives a range of evidence for the importance of that, from sports to business to writing comics to science.
I think that's a great statement, right? I mean, getting a PhD, as I'm sure many listeners know, it's very specialized. It's very like narrow. I mean, my dissertation is on the Karankawas, writing a general history of the Karankawas. Like, that's very narrow, and so it's my job as a historian to try to make that wider and more applicable for other Native groups. So that's what I'm trying to do, at least, to make a range, as you put it.
And then even beyond that, make it relevant to people. Like Richard Feynman, for example, great physicist, but he didn't become great just by focusing on the physics and putting everything else aside. He also learned to play the bongo drums. He did experiments on ants. I think he might have known, several different languages. Or the great mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss. A lot of people don't hear about him because he's did work that's much more abstract and sophisticated, beyond the Euclidean geometry or Newtonian calculus. But when he was, 16, 18, he was trying to decide what career he wanted to go into. He liked linguistics and he liked math. And then he proved the fundamental theorem of algebra, and so he went into math. But he knew languages. When he was like in his 30s or 40s or something, he took up Russian. And within 6 months or 2 years, people from Russia would swear he was native-born Russian.
Wow.
Knew a number of languages, would read papers from around the world every day. One of the greatest mathematicians of all time. I think he invented or was an early inventor of the telegraph. Studied physics.
What didn't he do?
Yeah, came up with like the heliotrope or something like that, which used light for surveying. So Gauss, Feynman, other people like that, they got diverse interests. And I think people who win Nobel Prizes are, I forget the exact statistic and stuff, 20 times more likely to have outside interests than others.
Interesting.
Yeah. But, so like, you're working on the car, you rock climb, you're interested in history. So, that's the kind of diversity that Epstein's talking about in the book Range.
Yeah, I think I'd just go crazy if I only could focus on one of those things, right? Like,
amen. Yeah.
There are some people I know of in graduate school or in academia where, this is their entire life and they're able to produce some incredible work, but at the same time, they have to sacrifice, relationships and other meaningful things in order to produce that significant work.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think a range of activities is very wise.
Yeah, agree. But, so getting into, some of the Native Americans here.
Sure.
Anything else about your background or how you got interested in history you want to discuss, bring up?
Oh, no, I think we did a good job covering it.
Cool. So, what have you learned about the Native Americans in this area? What can you tell us about, like their lifestyle, what they wore, what they ate? Just go wild.
Sure. There's a lot of different topics I'd like to discuss. I think one of the most important things for listeners to learn is this idea of native dominance. So right now in the historiography, which is pretty much like the history of historical works, or in other words, like the popular histories of native Texas, there's a thread going along that natives dominated Texas throughout Spanish colonization. So to put that another way, we had this myth that Spaniards came into Texas or wherever they, went into, and they conquered it and they put, natives to work. In Texas, that's definitely not the case. The Indians were the ones in power, and the Indians were the ones controlling the Spaniards. So you have books like, Juliana Barr's Peace Came in the Form of a Woman, Kathleen Duval's The Native Ground, Pekka Malainen's Comanche Empire, and all these books are saying that the natives were in control. This was an ocean of native power, and the Spaniards had little islands in this ocean. And so, for an example, a good example, I think, is that throughout the Spaniards' existence in Texas, they were paying tribute to many different Indian groups. And this tribute was, in large regards, to stop Indians from attacking them or stealing their supplies. And then I think in the 1770s, there was the leader or the commandant general of the interior provinces who was in charge of Texas actually suggested abandoning Texas entirely except for San Antonio because it was too much trouble for them to handle.
Now, what are some of the names of some of them books again? I'll put them in the show notes for folks if they want to look.
Oh, yeah, fantastic.
Comanche Empire.
Yeah, so we have Elizabeth John, Storms Brewed in Other Men's Worlds, Juliana Barr.
Say that, the title slower again, please, sorry.
Sure, yeah. In graduate school, it's like all we do is talk about these books, and so it's, yeah. So we just are able to rapid fire. So it's Elizabeth John, Storms Brewed in Other Men's Worlds. And she produced that book, I believe, in the 70s, and she was one of the first in Texas to really focus on, Native Americans. And then I think probably the most impactful book is Juliana Barr, Peace Came in the Form of a Woman. And she really talks about this idea of native dominance, probably the best in regards to Texas. And then we have Kathleen Duval, who wrote The Native Ground, and she's based out of UNC, so North Carolina. But her book focuses on the Mississippi Valley and how Native groups, again, controlled Anglo-Americans and other Europeans. And then Pekka Hamalainen wrote The Comanche Empire. In the Comanche Empire, he's essentially positing that the Comanches had an empire, that they exerted so much power that they should be considered an empire. And then I got a shout out to an SMU graduate named Matthew Babcock, who wrote Apache Adaptations to Spanish Rule. And he's kind of the one that talks about these frontier forests that the Spaniards established called presidios, how they were used as tribute dispensaries pretty much, and how natives would go there to acquire tributes. And in his case, specifically, he's talking about how these two groups work together.
Huh.
Yeah.
How do you spell his last name, Matthew?
Babcock.
Oh, okay.
It's B-A-B. Yeah.
Cool. And that was.
And there's all
Apache Adaptations to Spanish Rule.
Yeah, Hispanic Rule. Yeah. And there's the Spaniards, if we'll learn anything, the Spaniards in Texas and throughout, North and South America were incredible bureaucrats. They kept an amazing amount of records, much better than the English or the French. And so we can see this native dominance in their historical record. We see many different letters from citizens, from governors, from captains, all talking about how these natives are imposing on them. I'll think of an example, like for instance, I actually have this example already, and this came from the citizens of San Antonio. They're writing to their governor, and they wrote, "This province, which is Texas, is in such deplorable circumstances that there is not a scrap of meat left to eat, and a pound of butter cannot be found for any amount of money, much less a candle to light one's way. Furthermore, within 4 days, there will be no firewood left to burn. The hostiles will give us no respite. If this war continues for 2 more months, and it is obvious that it will continue until the enemy destroys everyone, the few persons that might remain will die of hunger." And I'll give you the link to that document because it's available to view online.
Cool. And when was that written?
I believe that was it's like 1777.
Okay.
I would need to find the link.
Interesting.
But again, it shows, the deplorable conditions, as it said, of the province, and that, the Spaniards are only able to stay in that province if the Indians allow them. I mean, in the middle of the Karankawa-Spanish War, the citizens of Goliad were afraid to go get water, which was only like 400 feet from their settlement, because they were afraid of being attacked by native groups who they were trying to commit genocide on. So it's a different environment than what we typically expect of Europeans and Indians.
Yeah. So, if we back up a little bit.
Sure.
So, in late 1490s, early 1500s, Europeans come over, I think bring disease. Wasn't there a massive die-off of Native Americans at that time because of the disease?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm glad you bring that up. So, 1492 is when Columbus, actually views this new world. And then disease are introduced over the next century or so. And scholars believe the uppermost estimates is that like maybe 85 to 90% of the native population are casualties of some sort.
So like 50% at least, maybe, or 30%?
Honestly, maybe 70% of the population died. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know it's up to 90%. But by the 18th century, you have somewhat of a population resurgence where the numbers return. And so that's kind of the situation you find in Texas. In Texas, we see disease hit it around 1528, and we say 1528 because that's when Cabeza de Vaca, a shipwrecked conquistador, landed on Texas shores, and he reported on disease, going across this area. But Texas, it's tricky because Texas isn't well recorded. There's not a lot of people or Europeans going into Texas up until maybe the late 17th century. So in the 1680s is finally when we get a lot of European records of natives in Texas. But prior to that time, we had to rely heavily on archaeology and a few European records. So it's hard for us to say.
Okay, so what we're talking about with the Spanish having to pay tribute to the Native Americans could have actually been much worse, because we're talking about a fraction of the population pre-European contact. Is that right?
I think that's definitely one way to look at it. I think when we think about disease and how it's changed, we need to think about how it changed cultures. Because if imagine 90% of the population in the world being a casualty of COVID, our culture already has changed, and that the number isn't 90%. And so what happens with all this disease impacting natives is that their cultures change and they adapt to all this. And so what comes of that is natives who are able to adapt and ask tribute from the Spaniards. But yeah, I think your point stands that if the disease hadn't been there, then the native presence would have been even larger.
Yeah, because I remember in reading some autobiographies or uh, something about the journal, the official report to the king of Cabeza de Vaca, the thing that he wrote, or maybe some biographies
Yeah.
about him. But yeah, they were saying how when he first came here, Texas was so populated. The way they put it was that you couldn't look anywhere and not see a campfire burning somewhere.
That's like, I think, phenomenal. Like, I think that's well said.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a lot of misconceptions. Like, when people ask like what natives live on the land that I live on now, it's a really hard question to answer because it depends on the period. Like, prior to European contact, you could have hundreds of different native groups in Texas, all unique, all have their own culture. There's dozens of different languages. But as time moves forward, you do see these Native American groups starting to consolidate. So Cypress Creek, right? Trying to pinpoint the Native American group that lives around Cypress Creek, this North Houston area, is very difficult. From maybe in the 1700s, we can say for sure it was like a consolidation of Akokisa people, Bidai people, Cocos and Mayais. So it was many different groups lived in that area. But prior to that time, there would be even more. But after that time, it consolidates further. You kind of just have the Akokisas and Bidai, or Bidai people living there.
Interesting. Now, when was this period of like Spanish settlement you're talking about, from like when to when?
Sure. So what happens is in 1685 or around that time, there's a French explorer named La Salle, and he tries to establish a French colony around Matagorda Bay on Garcitas Creek, and that fails. And the Spaniards are worried that the French are going to try again, or they're going to try to invade New Spain and acquire all their silver mines. And so they actually invade or attempt to invade Texas, and they put down forts and missions to kind of stake their claim. And so that happens in 1690. So from 1690 all the way up to like 1810 is considered the Spanish era. And throughout the entire time, they are just, again, like little islands in an ocean of native power, that natives are controlling them for a large regard throughout their existence.
And so before 1690, just in terms of the Europeans, it's more like a Wild West kind of.
Yeah, so prior to 1690, kind of the records we get are from these entradas, so expeditions like Coronado, those types of stuff, and ship logs. So we really don't get a lot of Europeans even going into Texas. There's a guy named like Captain Behringer who sailed into a port, or not a port, but a bay in Texas, Port Aransas, so in that area. And he just stayed with the native groups, and he wrote in his journal and describing these native groups. And that's kind of all the information we get in like a 20-year span. And then, so that area it's very dark as far as European historical records.
What was his name?
Captain Behringer. I'll actually have a PDF of his journal, which I'll give to you as well, so you can link that. It's a very fun read.
Cool. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah.
So, do you know why the Europeans weren't as interested in Texas at first, and then maybe like later they were protecting it because of the silver mines or other mines, or what's the deal?
Yeah, exactly. So like they become interested in it because of these imperial conflicts where they're trying to kind of provide a protective barrier against the French and the English. They want to protect their mining and their like profitable provinces in northern Mexico, what is now northern Mexico, from their imperial rivals. But it takes them a while to get to even be able to intrude into Texas because they face so much resistance from other native groups, and their colonization scheme is ineffective. They're trying to convert natives, and natives have no they have no need to convert. Spanish don't provide them much. They've also tried to incorporate these natives into their societies, and the natives, again, because they have power in these regions, don't need to incorporate into Spanish societies. So again, like their Spanish colonial creep just occurs very slow. It's like a snail's pace. And then finally in the 1690s, they have like a fort on the Rio Grande, and they have to travel hundreds of miles to try to fend off the French. And so when we think about the Spaniards in Texas, they're like a fingertip at the end of a very long Spanish arm. Like they're very, very isolated in Texas.
Okay, interesting.
I do want to point out too that the time previous to 1693, where there aren't many European records, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a very active place. Natives are trading and moving across North America and across Texas. In 1690, one of the survivors of that French settlement that tried to establish itself on Matagorda Bay, they're going north to be rescued, and they reach the Mississippi, and they find that natives are farming, I believe, like plum trees, apple trees, all these different European vegetation. And what that means is that these natives acquired seeds that were introduced like 1,000 miles away in present-day Mexico, that their trade routes ranged for at least 1,000 miles.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then that was in their tradition of the Native American tradition of kind of managing the land anyway. I've heard that when some Europeans came over in some places of the United States, they described it as being like an English garden. It was, like, I guess that would mean kind of managed but wild. I haven't dug into that, but there was, the Indians would select for certain nut trees and fruit trees, and so there could be these pecan groves or groves of other fruit. It's like an English garden in that sense, and so they weren't all stupid, idiotic people running around trying to find food wherever. They managed the land, and that's the kind of people we came from. It's like, I think one thing people need to study history more for, just to see that ancients weren't stupid. We come from smart people.
Yeah.
It's like, they didn't have cell phones, but hey, they didn't need them. They got along just fine, and they were like super smart. We come from rational animals because they were rational animals, and they were, really good at surviving and thriving in their context.
It's like they're the ones who built the foundation that we're sitting atop, that we're able to have all these amenities because of, our intelligent ancestors. I think a good example is when Anglo-American.
Sorry, really quickly. Sometimes we kind of go backward in history. It's not always going forward. It's like moving all around.
Teleological view. That's a great point. Yeah.
Like, okay, look at the Nazis. Is that an improvement? Not,
but there's pitfalls with history, and one of the pitfalls is thinking that history is always advancing for the greater good, that we're always advancing positively as a civilization. And that's a teleological view is not always the case, that humans are also prone to do some horrific things.
Unfortunately.
As far as...
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's not a progression. It's just a reflection of the wider spread choices that people make and the ideas they choose to follow. And could be a good reflection, could be a bad reflection, but it's a reflection, not necessarily a progression necessarily forward.
Yeah.
But you're going to say about the developing thing, I think, before I threw that comment in, something.
Oh, I was going to mention, you talked about how people have this notion that natives didn't know what they were doing, and how that's just definitely not the case. There's a dichotomy of, Europeans coming over, and they view this land as either, totally wild and, ripe for the taking, or they note how, natives have groomed it, as you said, an English garden almost. And so these perceptions of land as a tool almost for Europeans, right? Where if they consider the land, if they portray the land as wild and untamed, and it gives them a right to take this land. So you do have more folks, saying that the land's untamed than those that consider it to be a garden. But in the case of Texas, the land was well managed by native groups and native peoples. What happens, which is important to point out, is this little ice age. So from like around 1300 to 1800, the Earth experienced what is known as the little ice age. So there's colder temperatures. And in Texas, what this meant is that desert areas or areas that are now desert were much greener. There's much more vegetation. And so you would have large grazing animals like bison going all the way down to, Houston and Corpus Christi, all the way down to the coast, down to the Rio Grande. And so natives pick up on this, and they focus their life on hunting and gathering. So at the same time that, Little Ice Age is making, hunting and gathering bison more preferable, it makes agriculture less preferable because of this extreme weather. Farming is not as persistent or reliable as it was in the past. So in the past, there was this medieval warming period, and this warming period allowed for, peoples across the earth to produce a lot of different foods. But when this ice age came on, agriculture wasn't as reliable, and therefore people and, historians believe that causes conflict and violence. And so we see that along the Mississippi Valley for sure, where these great agricultural groups aren't able to produce the same amount of food, and therefore these large cities are dispersing to smaller settlements which focus on hunting and gathering. And that definitely happened in Texas.
Yeah, interesting. And yeah, there used to be more prairie here. There was actually the Katy Prairie. That makes sense, having a lot of bison or other grazing animals in the area at one time.
Yeah, that really caught me off guard, this idea that bison were here. As you said, yeah, like this was a prairie. Like there were grasslands all across what is now desert.
Or I think too, I think some places used to be more prairie, but then Europeans made it more into a forest.
Yeah. And that's the thing too. With the Europeans, this Columbian exchange, what these Europeans introduced changed the landscape, and the foremost among them is the horse. The horse allowed natives to hunt bison and other animals to an extent never before seen, really, and allowed them to trade and move again to a larger extent. And so you see societies developing around the horse, and the horse is a game changer. It really allows like the Comanches, for instance, as Peckham points out, to become an empire, to have enough power to exert their will over other empires in that area.
Mm-hmm. And I think I have to remember the dates and everything, but I know in another episode, talking to someone about history, there were, I think, actually heard of wild horses in the Katy Prairie even into the maybe late 1800s, early 1900s.
Wow.
But that's in another episode I did.
Which episode is that?
That's geez, brain. Come on, work brain. I'll send you a link to that.
Oh, fantastic!
And I got
thank you.
Some show notes. I don't know if I found that, was able to put it in the show notes, but information about the people that live there anyway, the family.
It reminds me of, you interviewed Dan Flores, and he's a wonderful author. He wrote this book called Coyote Nation, which I'm sure you've read.
Yeah.
He talks about that, how that coyotes adapted, and they're found in places no one would really ever expect, like in New York City. And so nature finds a way. It always will survive.
And I'd like to find this quote. I know Victor Hugo said something that in a novel he wrote, I read decades ago. I was reminded of it, came to my memory recently, but he's talking about a little different than what you were saying, but how people in Europe, in the novel, he's talking about having this great battle and they kill each other, and then nature responds with birds chirping and the sun shining. Just, it's the contrast that he's bringing up. Like amidst its destruction, there's all this beauty in nature. I don't remember the exact point he was making in that, but that was interesting. I got to find that. Put that on Facebook or something.
It's a good Facebook quote, Twitter quote.
Yeah, but look, people, focus on the beauty.
I like that.
But so many questions to ask, and I'm just like pausing, just like, man, what can we talk about now? But also maybe do a few more minutes. Don't want to take too much of your time. You probably got to go soon. I got to work, teaching privately online in a little while. But what can you maybe tell us about some of the locals to like kind of wrap up? What else might you want to say about them?
Sure. Let's see. As you said, there's many different topics. I could talk about how they were identified, what they ate, what their customs were. I'll talk about how they were. Excuse me. Yeah, I'll talk about how they were identified. So, clothing or that type of thing. So, in our area, or today at least, we are identified by the clothes we wear. But among Native groups in Texas, identifying features were usually done through tattoos and hairstyles. So Native groups had different tattoo styles, and that would, show who they belonged among. And same with hairstyles, especially along the Mississippi Valley. So that was a way to identify each other. And so you have this story of a French child being abducted and adopted into a Karankawa family, and they are tattooed across their entire body. All these French children are tattooed, and somehow maybe 2 decades later they end up back in Texas, and they're able to guide these Europeans, these Frenchmen, across Texas without much incident. They did run into a war party of Karankawas, but without much without any errors or whatever, because of their tattoos. William C. Foster, his historian, or maybe it was Robert Weddell, called it their passport through Texas.
What did they use to tattoo? Do you know? What kind of materials?
I'm not exactly sure. I believe some people have speculated that it was charcoal, that they would put charcoal, they would stab in the charcoal underneath the skin. But I'm really not certain.
And it would last their whole life?
It could also be like some form of asphaltium, which is like this naturally occurring oil substance that floats up from the ocean and lands on the beaches. But yeah, I'm not very familiar. I couldn't say for sure.
And do you know, like, did it last their whole life, or did they have to have it redone every now and then?
I couldn't say. As far as at least 2 decades worth, because these Talon children came back and they still had the same tattoos for quite some time. They ended up being, the Spaniards say they rescued them, but the Spaniards kidnapped them from the Karankawas, and the Spaniards in all their records are saying how they're trying to remove the tattoos through all these different means, how they were rubbing them with all these soaps and everything, and they can never get the tattoos off. So the tattoos seem to be pretty durable.
Were they just like all black, or did they have a way to use color in them? So red, blue, green, or anything like that?
That's a curious question. I'm not quite sure. It's hard to find this out because unlike other items, the human body decomposes besides its bones quite quickly. So it's hard to find out.
I wonder if that's in any documents or pictures or anything.
Yeah, there are some descriptions of native tattoos of other Indians, but they're not very detailed. That's always a rarity because when these European explorers come through this area, occasionally you get some really good diarists who record the native cultures and all that other things, but the military men often aren't that way, where they are more interested in landmarks than the cultures around them. So as a historian, you really have to dig and find this information.
Be like Sherlock Holmes or something.
Exactly, and that's an important thing to bring up too. Whenever you, as for listeners need to realize that whenever you're reading about native Texas, you need to keep in mind that a lot of this research comes from European accounts. So we're only getting one side, like a one-sided view of the past, of their history, and that historians of today are trying to add a native side or a native element. But that's difficult, right? Because native sources aren't as easy to come by as these archived colonial Spanish documents.
You know what?
And so we're thinking.
Go ahead, sorry.
Sure, what was that?
I was just going to ask. Oh, go ahead and finish that. Then I was going to ask something else.
Sure. As far as like native sources, we can use like oral histories. So, creation myths of native peoples that still survive today, how they viewed their past. There's also other groups that have things like calendar sticks. So I forgot the exact indigenous group, but they actually recorded, maybe it was the Lakotas, they recorded on this stick or on a piece of animal skin, like what the big event was for the year. And so historians can read through that and get the native perspective from that.
Cool. Do you know what some of the tattoos or hairstyles were for people in this area, like the Akokisa or the Badai?
I would know more about the Mississippi Valley just because Kathleen Duval has written about it. As for the Akokisa and Badai, I don't. I could talk more about them though, because I'm actually writing an article about them. So whenever people think of natives in Texas, they typically focus on like the Apaches, the Caddos, the Comanches, the Tonkawas, and the Wichitas. the Akokisa, the Badais, the Mayais, and the Kokos, which all lived where you live, around the Cypress Creek area, are kind of put off to the side. But that grouping of Indians, which all were intermarried and intermixed by the 1700s, were extremely significant. I'm calling them intermediaries or middlemen in trade. So they were extremely significant because these Indians would go to other Indian groups and trade with them, and they would go to the Spaniards and trade with them. So they were able to access all these different items and go to all these different groups, Europeans, other native groups, and give them these items. And so they were considered, I consider them to be these middlemen in Texas. But again, with there being so many native groups in this region, it's hard to remember all of them, right? Like, as I said, in the 1500s and 1600s, there were hundreds, maybe even more native groups. And it's easier for us to condense them down into larger groupings and to remember each individual tribal name.
Yeah, blows your mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Too much information. I can't handle it. But interesting. But cool. Hopefully we can talk again sometime, get into more detail. There's still a lot we can discuss and get into more detail about Akokisa and the local Indians and all that, and so much more to discuss, so little time. But yeah, if we could, that'd be cool.
I would love to. I really appreciate you having me on. And if you ever have any other questions, or if listeners have any questions about native groups, tell them feel free to contact me.
Cool.
If you type in karankawas.com, you can contact me through there. You can also look through SMU.
Yeah, I was lucky to stumble upon you just doing a search on this and that. Then I come across your website. It's like, whoa, there's some pretty cool stuff here. It's like, contact this guy and see if he ignores me or not. Yay, he emailed back. Whoa. But cool.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. I can just go on and on as you experienced.
Me too. I wish I had the time. Yeah. But, cool. Much appreciated, Tim. So.
Sure. No problem.
So, thank you. You have a good day, and hope to talk to you soon. So.
Likewise. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye-bye.